Okay, good day to you all, and welcome to this session of what we call TPP, a trade policy preview of Japan by the Friends of Multilateralism Group, FMG. My name is Xiankun LU. I'm the CEO of the group. Today, my colleague Clem, who has always been leading on this initiative of our group, has got some family issues, so he has to leave us. So I will try to sit in his big shows and then try to moderate. But of course, we have a good panel and with excellent speakers. So whatever I do wrong will be corrected by the good presentations to come. So one word about the TPP, the trade policy preview. It was something that Alex and I have developed together as kind of a way to provide a kind of informal candidate kind of framework with which that the experts could discuss about the trade policy orientation and also perspective of one selected member. And also, how do we relate that to its role in the multilateral system, as well as how that would impact on the system and its work. So that's the background. And today we have a panel with Simon Evenett and Nakatomi-san. Both are our long-standing FMG members. And also we have discussant Masa-san, and who will help complement on our discussions. I won't go further into the details to introduce them because all of them do not need introduction, and their details could be found afterwards on our website. So I will just go straightly to the presentations, starting from Simon. You have 15 minutes, Simon, please.
Thank you, Lou. Thank you, Lou, for this opportunity to present on the TPR of the world's third largest economy. In this presentation, I will start off with some contextual observations, then turn to Japan's current trade policy stance. Then I will turn to the evolution of its trade policy stance since the last TPR in July 2020. Then I will discuss some interesting digital trade policy developments where Japan has been in the vanguard of developments. Then I'll turn to Japan's stake in the system. And as is usual, I will not offer any conclusions. I'll offer some questions which I think arise from the evidence that I'm going to provide. In terms of the contextual remarks, the last TPR took place in July 2020. At that time, the chair of the TPR noted a number of observations in their concluding remarks. They referred, as usual, to the highly protected nature of Japan's agricultural sector, the use of non-tariff measures in respect of NAMA. Also, concerns were expressed about FDI screening measures, incentives to repatriate production from China, and also some digital policy related matters. And as we will see, some of these factors recur in the material that I will share with you. As for macroeconomic context, Japan's GDP peaked in real terms, measured in US dollars, at around $4.4 trillion in 2018 and has stagnated ever since. In fact, Japan's GDP has largely stagnated for a decade, despite many stimulus measures. Japanese GDP per capita has risen a little bit over time, but hourly compensation for workers has not. Unemployment remains very low at around 2.5% of the workforce. And when you turn to trade performance, Japan's imports and exports to the rest of the world in both goods and services have either fallen or stagnated from peaks. So this is a country whose national income has stagnated and whose engagement with the world economy on leading metrics has stagnated. And these are, I think this provides important macro context for what is going to come. In terms of Japan's commercial policy stance today, the Japanese trade regime, at least the tariff regime, has complete binding coverage. There's very little tariff binding overhang on non-agricultural goods, and many goods are bound at zero tariffs. when we look at our database, we find that for every Japanese measure that favors foreign commercial interests, there are 12 that harm trading partners. This ratio is high, but it's lower than some countries we have reviewed, such as the United States. When Japan does open its markets, it takes the form of tariff cuts. When Japan favors local firms, it takes the form of subsidies. And 80% of Japan's harmful measures, that's barriers to trade or trade distortions, are concentrated in just 20 goods and services sectors. Let me amplify these points with some data. The Global Trade Alert database has at the moment just under 1,000 measures which are in force in Japan, which we've recorded. The data I'm going to show you relates to the situation at the end of January of this year. And we can see that the 12-to-1 ratio that I highlighted comes out in the last column of this data. Japan is also affected by a large number of measures abroad, and this I will take up when I discuss Japan's stake in the system. Almost all of the records that we have on Japan's public policies come from official sources. Only 4 come from non-official sources. More generally, given the amount that Japan trades and the size of its economy, the amount of information on Japan's policies are slight. In fact, they're very much in the lower portion of the G20 membership. Japan has, with the exception of SPS, Japan typically has much less information available about tariff measures, non-tariff measures, and alike. And this will come out as I will show you in the slides that follows. In this slide, I summarize the current state of play in terms of Japanese commercial policy. 74 measures improve foreign treatment of foreign traders. Most of them are tariff cuts. That's shown in the left-hand column. In the right-hand column, there are 902 measures which worsen the treatment of foreign trading interests. Most of them are made up of export-related measures. The one area where Japan is exceptionally transparent is in support that it gives for its exporters, mainly through generous trade financing regimes, but there are also a large number of subsidies given to its firms to acquire assets abroad, or subsidies or loans. In terms of subsidies to domestic commercial interests, this is the second biggest category, which we will see will play an important role as well. More generally, I mean, there is concerns about the availability of evidence on Japan's trade measures, both good and bad. Using the data that we had available to us and tracking down the 6-digit HS codes associated with policy interventions, it's possible to estimate at the end of January of this year the exposure of different groups of countries to Japan's trade reforms. The least developed countries stand out in terms of having the greatest exposure to unilateral trade policy reforms by Japan, followed by the United States and Latin America. As you can see, the percentages tail off considerably as you go across this chart. But in general, the shares of exports exposed to Japanese trade reforms are much lower than other G20 members. When we turn to exposure to trade distortions and trade restrictions, there the percentages are much higher. And you can see here that 52% of of LDC exports to Japan face some type of trade distortion. That was in effect at the end of January. And you can see for many other groups of countries, around 30% of their exports are facing either trade barriers or trade distortions in the Japanese market. So this gives you a sense of the exposure to Japanese reforms and Japanese trade barriers. I should add that because of the inability to document, in many cases, Japanese measures, that these percentages are almost certainly underestimates. This will be a point I'll come back to later. In terms of the sectoral coverage of Japan's favoritism for local firms, this is concentrated in just 20 sectors. 3 of them are service sectors. The other 17 are manufacturing sectors that Japan is well known for. And these sectors have received lots of mainly subsidies and other forms of state aid. Turning now to the evolution of Japan's commercial policy stance since the last TPR, we have seen the following. Since July 2020, the trade reforms that Japan has introduced have covered less than 2% of its good imports. Meanwhile, the trade restrictions and subsidies to import competing firms cover over 15% of its goods imports. The latter number is likely to be an underestimate for reasons I'll come back to. Most of the goods imports were put at a disadvantage in Japan because subsidies were awarded to local import competing firms. And the sectors which have been favored by Japanese commercial policy restrictions and distortions have not changed much since the last TPR. So you get a sense of the one-sided nature of the movements in Japanese trade policy as far as goods is concerned. That is borne out in this chart. In this chart, we start from the day after the last TPR, and we estimate the percentage of Japanese goods imports which are covered by measures that have been introduced since the last TPR and that were in effect in 2021 and 2022. You can see the red lines lie above the green lines. The red lines show you the shares of imports, goods imports facing trade discrimination, and most of the share that we see of around 15 or 16% face subsidies to local import competing firms. To the extent that Japan has liberalized its good imports at all, that's the 2% figure earlier, it's mainly in the form of tariff reductions. So this gives you a sense of the evolution since the last TPR. We were not satisfied with the ability to document Japanese measures in the traditional manner. Our data set does not normally cover TPT and SBS, but in this case, we went further and did the following. We went into the EPING database and extracted all Japan's SPS notifications. And what we did was estimate for each year the share of imports into Japan that were covered by new SPS regulations. And so this chart here shows you the period since the last TPR and before the last TPR. And what is striking about it is that with the exception of China, every year, many different trading partners of Japan face new SPS measures. So this is not the accumulation of SPS measures over time. This is the share of exports facing new SPS measures every year. And one question that arises from this is whether it's necessary for Japan to reissue new SPS measures every year, and whether or not this adds additional costs to foreign trading partners who are trying to export agricultural goods to Japan. We did the same exercise for TBT measures and NAMA imports, and here there's an even more striking finding. If you look at the annual TPT notifications in the EPING database, and you draw out the products which are associated with those notifications, you will see that as we get into the pandemic era, 2020, 2021, there's suddenly a jump in the trade coverage of those TPT notifications. And you can see that for the EU and the United States, every year about a quarter of their exports to Japan used to face a new TPT measure, and that rose to over half during the pandemic era. For the other countries, the shares of their exports every year facing new TBT regulations in Japan was less than 10% before the pandemic, and then suddenly surges to 30 and then 50%. And so a question arises as to why there was suddenly an expansion in goods covered or imports covered by TBT regulations during the pandemic and not before. So this highlights maybe that there may be other policies which are influencing market access into Japan. When it comes to subsidies, we dug further too. Fortunately, the Development Bank of Japan is very transparent in its annual report in how the Japanese government supports its industries. It does so largely through the banking system, either through loans from the Development Bank of Japan or private financial institutions. This part is transparent. What is not transparent is the nature and the volume of these loans, which are issued on a transaction by transaction basis. So in this respect, the Development Bank of Japan, like others banks in Japan, do not follow the practice of, say, the European Investment Bank or Canada's Export Development Agency, which also offers lots of loans to Canadian firms. In both of the latter two cases, there is transaction by transaction information available. Such transparency is not found in Japan. In terms of the volume of loans from the Development Bank of Japan, we can see that since 2008, when the crisis response operations began, approximately $2 trillion in current exchange rates of loans have been lent to Japanese firms. And when you look at the lower section here, where we can relate the amounts of loans given to the number of projects, it's not uncommon. Well, the average loan size is about $52 million, which is a sizable amount of money. So this gives you a sense of the amount of money which is being pushed through the Japanese banking system in with or backed by Japanese government money. And this would suggest then that the publicly recorded subsidies that we've been able to find are probably a fraction of the state support for Japanese industry that is in existence. So the last three slides may go some way to help explain why, at least in terms of tracking the traditional trade policy measures and subsidies that we found, the import shares shown earlier were much lower than you find in other G20 countries. When it comes to which trading partners are most exposed to Japan's commercial policies, I summarize the key points here. China and many developing country groups of the WTO, they are less exposed to Japanese trade distortions than higher income countries. It also pays to have a regional trading agreement with Japan. Exposure to new trade distortions since the last DPR tends to be lower. And I'll show you that nevertheless, there are 20 economies that have seen more than $1 billion of their exports put at risk by measures taken by Japan since the last DPR. So this is the slide which shows you since the last DPR, what is the growth of goods imports covered by Japanese trade restrictions and trade distortions. All of the developing country groups that I mentioned earlier lie below that line, suggesting that their imports are less affected by Japanese measures since July 2020. This chart here, slide number 19, shows you again in red is the average for the world, and this shows you in the light blue and light and dark green lines that countries that have regional trading agreements with Japan tend to face less trade discrimination since the last TPR. So this gives you a sense of who of Japan's trading partners are affected. If you then look country by country, we can pull out the market access at risk in the Japanese market from Japanese measures taken since July 2020. There are 20 such countries, and you can see that there are at least 7 of them which have $10 billion of exports at risk from measures taken by Japan. So this gives you a sense of which of Japan's trading partners are most affected. Turning now to digital trade, Japan has been an active proponent of trade norms and trade cooperation on digital trade. This also is reflected in their significant program of measures at home to regulate the digital economy. Japan has taken or enhanced its privacy legislation in the last 2 years, and in fact, to its credit, in 2022, extended rules that it had applied to foreign firms on privacy to domestic firms as well, thereby eliminating some potential discrimination. The other point to make here is that Japan's approach to competition law enforcement is perhaps less aggressive than that in the United States and the European Union. Japan typically takes the promises of the big internet companies as sufficient when it's investigating potential anti-competitive practices. The approach appears to be more to nudge the large firms to improve their behavior, not to prosecute them. When it comes to commercial diplomacy, Japan has been an advocate of data-free flow with trust, and this is an initiative it has pushed at the G7 and is attempting to bridge the European and American perspectives on this matter. And I think one of the interesting questions is whether or not that can become a blueprint for other nations. And Japan has been very active in incorporating e-commerce chapters into its RTAs and signing digital partnership agreements. My last substantive section before wrapping up turns to Japan's diminished stake in the world trading system. Since the last TPR, Japan's exports are in products which have benefited from trade reforms in overseas nations, but only 15% of its exports by value have benefited from trade reforms since 2020, whereas half of its goods exports have faced worse trading conditions. Moreover, there are 17 of Japan's trading partners that have taken steps to threaten or reduce the market access of Japanese exports by $1 billion or more, and 7 of those nations are imperiling more than $5 billion of Japanese exports. Measures targeting Japan are very rare. What we can see on this chart here is the countries which have taken measures which have impacted Japan's market access abroad. The United States stands out as a country which has taken a lot of such measures. The scale of its measures covering Japan's exports are significant. There's no suggestion here that Japan's exports are being targeted, merely that the fallout from American measures has covered a lot of Japanese exports. China and Germany also have taken measures which cover more than $10 billion of Japanese exports. Let me then just wrap up with some questions which arise from this evidence. So the first question is, other than measures to promote digital trade and digital trade rules, what strategy does Japan have to advance the living standards at home and to get out of this stagnation through openness of other sectors of its economy? Secondly, why did the share of Japanese NAMA imports covered by new TPT measures rise so much during the pandemic? And what assurances can Japan give that these new measures were not a disguised form of protectionism? The third question is, what purpose is served by Japan issuing so many new SPS measures each year that cover such very large shares of its agricultural imports? Are there alternative SPS regimes which might provide more stability to importers? Fourth, what steps can Japan take to improve the transparency of the state aid that it provides to firms via state development banks? And here again, I've already made reference to practices of other state development banks, such as the EIB and Japan and Canada's EDC. And the last question is, are there any lessons for the multilateral trading system of Japan's attempt to bridge differences within the G7 relating to digital regulation? And I ask this question in light, of course, of the interest in the work in e-commerce at the WTO. So I conclude my presentation here and hand it back to Lou. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very, very much, Simon, as always, for your really comprehensive presentations on various aspects of the Japanese trade policy. And I also like very much those questions you posed at the end. I think those will be good for follow-up discussions. If I may add just one thing to that question list is that, and how do we relate this to the ongoing WTO work, especially I mean, in your presentations, you also pointed out that the Japanese agriculture market and also policy has always been a kind of hit point in the WTO system. I mean, Japan is always a key player in the Doha agriculture negotiations and also especially the subsidies. So it will be good to listen to either Nakatomi-san or Kono-san on how this would be, Japan would look at its future reforms and how that may help push forward the WTO negotiations on agriculture, which is right now stuck. Just one point to mention here, actually, that's a key point of our planned initiative by FMG on the subsidies. So agriculture and these subsidies will be key on the list. So with that, I'll give floor now to Nakatomi-san. Natalie, could you help share the screen? Yeah. So it's on now. I think we can all see it. So yeah. Nakatomi-san, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for introducing me. Yeah, I'm fairly new to FMG, and I'm sorry that I haven't attended any TPP exercise in the past. So I try my best to, I think, explain the background of Japanese policies and also the views of the business in general. And in a Q&A session, I think I would like to answer to some of Simon's, I think, comments and points that's made. And because time is limited, so I'd like to explain. But first, the key principles of Japanese trade policies And next, in the next part, I'd like to touch upon major recent development and factors in Japan's trade policies. I think I begin from here. And Japan is constantly supporting WTO as the central pillar of trade policies. Yeah. Myself, I was in Geneva from 92 to 95 at the time of the preparation for the conclusion of the round. And I worked on dumping issues and so on and so forth around that time. I worked on NAMA and so on and so forth. But that's just on myself. But WTO and multilateralism are viewed by the government and also the business as the central pillar of the trade system. Still, I think Japanese government and business supports WTO. But the business is frustrated with the slowness of, I think, the discussion in Geneva. I have a reference from Keidanren. Today, perhaps I think Morita-san with Keidanren is hearing, I think, this session. And there's, I think, good report coming from Keidanren September 2021. I think that will, I think, express the view held by the business. We are committed to WTO system and its development. Of course, the themes we are pursuing, I think, constantly, I think, changing, but we are committed to, I think, helping the WTO system and its development. And we observe WTO rules and we perform its obligations. And we are constantly actively involved in rulemaking and liberalization in the WTO. Myself, I was, I think, deeply involved in ITA 1. I was a negotiator of ITA 1 in 1997. And the interesting, I think, thing about, I think, our attitude on MFN is in services, I think, agreement in GATS, we have no MFN reservations, but that's perhaps special for Japan. And Japan is an active user of WTO dispute settlement. We have 20 cases as a complainant. Some other countries have more cases, but anyway, Japanese government and the Japanese business supports, I think, WTO dispute settlement system. I'll touch upon this issue later again. And as Simon, I think, expressed, certainly transparency is very important. And our view is that I think notification is transparent and the notification, I think, requirements are carried out based on WTO. And business strongly supports WTO as the most effective and efficient organization and express concerns on its present status. Though, as I explained, we have many FTAs. FTAs are just a supplement to the WTO system, and the basis is the WTO. Next page, please. Yeah, and we are also actively involved in FTA EPAs to supplement the WTO. And we have actively developed and negotiated the FTAs, EPAs to supplement the liberalization and rulemaking in WTO. And of course, we are, I think, having FTAs in a consistent manner with the requirements of the WTO. Now we have FTAs in force and signed. The number is 21. FTAs in negotiation 3. And trade coverage of FTAs in force and sign is now about 80%. Japan is a relatively late comer to the FTA formation race, so 80% is something. And as I heard from Simon, but in many circumstances, FTA is useful to change, I think, the relationship between two countries because now FTA has many chapters and many, I think, relevant problems can be discussed in that framework. For example, 20 years ago, when I attended Japan-EU bilateral trade meeting, but that was carried out just once a year or so. But how many, I think, negotiations do we have now? Well, things are changing, I think, based on FTAs. That's one of the explanation. This chart explains, I think, the structure of FTAs and the present status of FTAs. Next page, please. Thank you. And we are promoting plurilateral, regional, and other initiatives and collaborates with key international organizations for developing our trade regime with other countries. I will touch upon plurilateral initiatives later. About the regional initiatives, for example, APEC is an example. And in APEC, we have CBPR, that's privacy rule. And in Japan, Japanese government and business supports tariffs on environment goods initiative there. And about international organizations with OECD, we are discussing privacy issues, data flow issues, and of course, we discuss with World Bank, UNCTAD area, standardization bodies like ISO, IC, because regulatory collaboration is very important and standards are very important for not only for Japan, but for other countries as well. Regarding other initiatives, this year, Japan is a chair country of G7 summit. And in 2019, Japan chaired the G20. And we are working on a free and open Indo-Pacific, I think, initiative. And now we are discussing how IPEF will be, I think, crafted. But that's on the process now. Thank you very much. Next page. And the fourth pillar is facilitating value chains and enhancing business activities. Economic activities are based on highly developed global value chains on goods, services, technologies, and finance. But that's the basis of, I think, Japanese business activities. And we are committed to enhancing and facilitating global business activities. And if I explain some of the necessary elements there, we put emphasis on connectivity, transparency, sustainability, autonomy. Yeah. And sometimes I think in Japan, so people are speaking about establishing value chains with trust. Trust is the basis for discussing these things and to have mutually, I think, meaningful value chains. And Keidanren last year in September, I think wrote a report toward the reconstruction of the free and open international economy that deal with not only, I think a free trade system, but they are putting emphasis on such things on digital economy and national, I think, security type of thing together. Now I think we need to look at many elements. And looking at, I think, the nature of, I think, Japanese trade. Now, trade is, of course, important, but investment is another element we put emphasis at this moment, because now we look at the trade figures. So trade balance is smaller than income balance. That means, I think, we get money by the result of investment. And if we look at the investment figure, especially on inward FDI, inward FDI stock reached 40 trillion yen. I think that was exactly the amount of, I think, Japanese government target in 2020. And the government expanded the figure from 40 to 80 in 2030. And we have BITs, and now we have Japanese government has 94 BITs with 94 countries and the regions. This includes the BITs in negotiation. And Japanese government and business supports investment facilitation and negotiation. Well, that's under JSI. Next page, please. Yeah. And I will move on to, I think, the major recent developments and factors in Japan's trade policies. About WTO reform, Japan is actively involved in WTO reform discussion in many areas, including dispute settlement. And for example, a consideration of the possibility of alternative measures such as, I think, let me see, excuse me. MPIA is on table, but METI, in collaboration with the experts, I think had carried out a study, and that's on table. And there's, I think, a serious discussion going on in Japan. And regarding FTAs, Japan pursues high-level disciplines and liberalization with a view to leading to global rules in future. And we don't want spaghetti ball effects in any circumstances. Next page. Yeah, about recent FTAs, as you know, we have RCEP and Japan-UK FTA. And in addition, we've been renegotiated and we've updated with Singapore, Mexico, and now we are discussing with Indonesia, Philippines, and Thailand for possible changes of the agreement. We don't, I think FTAs in table can stay for a long time. We need to change the content so that I think business relationship also can be, I think, changed. And regarding CPTPP, now it's enforcing most of the members and accession requests from 5-6 aspirant economies now. Next page. And about plurilateral initiatives, typical examples are ITA and ITA2. And now Japan is actively engaged in JSI in services domestic regulations. Now I think about we very much appreciate that services domestic regulation is now concluded. And we are putting emphasis on e-commerce, investment facilitation, MSMEs, and so on and so forth, to support rulemaking in the WTO. And the question is how we can realizing meaningful results and binding agreements in the WTO, which has a consensus decision-making rule. That's a difficult question, but we need to tackle. And pursuing results from plurilateral initiatives such as JSI for MC13, I think that's something that we need to work harder. And regarding e-commerce, I think there's a statement by the chair of the group, Australia, Japan, Singapore. And as you may know, I think the target is end of 23, or by end of 23, we would like to finish the negotiation. Number 4, a response to disorders and anomalies in global value chains. That may relate to, I think, the points I think made by Simon. Or there are, I think, roughly speaking, I think 3 backgrounds. One is recent introduction of trade measures, restrictions, and so on and so forth by big economies. Second is, of course, I think that's the same for everybody, COVID-19. And thirdly, Russia-Ukraine war. The above and other factors such as regional concentration of key products are affecting GBCs and business behaviors seriously. And Simon's, I think, analysis was very interesting because other countries' measures, I think, are affecting Japan. Perhaps Japanese measures are affecting other countries. Well, we need to look at, I think, both ways. And reinforcing supply chains becomes essential for all players. And so we need to discuss further how we can reinforce supply chains to benefit all the countries. Next page. Next page, please. Yeah. And environmental protection and global warming. Well, Simon pointed out that on digital issues, I think Japan is working hard, but The other area of emphasis is environment and so-called GX, I think, a green revolution. Japan is strengthening efforts in preserving global environment in line with COP results. And for example, Japan has a commitment to carbon neutrality in 2050 and 46% plus reduction by 2030. That's extremely, I think, a high target. Under, I think, the present technology, the number cannot be realized. So in Japan, now there's a serious discussion going on in government and also in business. So to try to change, I think, that our economy, try to change the structure of our economy to realize these goals. I think this is a kind of a chance for Japanese industry to change. Well, in 1970s and early 1980s, Japan faced, I think, so-called oil shock twice, but Japan survived. And by doing that, I think actually the structure of Japanese economy changed. Well, there's, I think, similar discussion going on back in Tokyo. I'm now in Tokyo. Yeah, and to change, I think, Japanese, I think, industry structure. That's becoming a national target as well. About Japanese, I think, economic policy, I will touch upon, I think, other items later. But together with digital, the environment is extremely important for us to change, in collaboration with other countries, of course. And in energy and environment areas, actually to realize that, I think Japanese government, I think, revised the long-term energy plan. I may touch upon that, I think, if necessary. And Japanese government and the business put emphasis on 3 E&S: energy security, economic efficiency, environment, and safety at the basis. I think I explain in detail, but if you have a question, also I can answer. And on stance on CBAM, cross-border adjustment mechanism, any measures should, among other things, be designed to be consistent and prevent carbon leakage with the least effect on trade. I think that's a position shared by the industry and also by the government as well. And number 6, I already explained, and I may supplement on the necessity of DX in Japan. But one thing I can add further is that there's a digital agency which was established 2021 that deals with, I think, many, I think, procedural aspects and so on and so forth. And that's working hard. That's very good for our economy. And number 7, SDGs and corporate governance. We, I think, pursuing, I think, SDG goals. But yeah, and perhaps also Kono-san knows better than myself on this issue. And next page, please. And finally, well, national security element is now being discussed. Japan introduced the economic security law in 2022. I wrote down, I think, the main focus area there. There are 4 areas there. And now I think the law is in the process of implementation. The speed is different. Yeah, and business supports the law and emphasizes the necessity of strengthening supply chains in full consultation with the business and due transparency. Thank you very much. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nakatomi-san. Really very comprehensive presentation. I mean, touch upon many aspects of the Japanese trade policy and also its role in the WTO. I mean, one immediate takeaway from that is that it's good to hear that, as you say, the WTO still remains central pillar of the Japanese trade policy. It has been active for both multilaterally, regionally, and plurilaterally. And if I remember correctly, that Japan is also the first donor to the WTO fisheries funding mechanism, which was announced recently. Maybe one thing we probably, if possible, could hear more, because Japan, as you said, is going to be a G7 host country this year. I mean, we know that G7 in the past several years has been becoming more and more active on trade policy WTO reform. So it'll be good to see how Japan would carry on that work on the WTO reform and the multilateral trading system. So we are running a little bit late behind the schedule, but I'll immediately give the floor to Kono-san, and so he could make some good comments on the two presentations. Kono-san, please.
Thank you so much, Lou, and thank you for having me. I did not prepare any slides, but I wonder if I can share with you a kind of a resume. If you can see this. Well, it sort of lays down some of the issues that I wish to discuss. And first of all, I'm completely new to this process and your group. It's an honor and pleasure, but I learned about your group only a few weeks ago when Clem asked me whether I can join this session. So whatever I say, it may be out of context, but please excuse me because I'm indeed a complete newcomer. Now, having said that, excuse me, since the two previous speakers, they have really made a comprehensive overview of the relevant issues and with a lot of technical detail as well. I don't think I can be talking at that level. I'm not a trade expert per se. I did cover trade policy during my tenure at the OECD until about a year ago, but that was only one subject alongside with others. I did spend, by the way, 4 years in Geneva at the WTO in the late 1990s when the very last agreements under the Uruguay round were concluded, and I was then working on it in the Secretariat as a financial services expert. So again, my expertise is a bit limited to that area. But anyway, if I may start with the macroeconomic situation and the economic environment that Japan faces, it is indeed in quite a tight spot, and there is very little room for further fiscal expansion, for monetary policy to be more accommodative or supportive of a sustainable growth. In fact, the hands of the new BOJ governor will be tied, and there's very little room, meaning that whatever the Japanese government wants to do in terms of trying to address the stagnation that Simon referred to at the outset of his presentation, the government will have to rely on structural policy. And well, just to say that trade policy would need to be reconsidered in this context, of course, I mean, if you think of extreme examples, when you have an economic difficulty, if you have very little macroeconomic policy levers, what will you do? And maybe I don't have to go to the 1930s Smoot-Hawley Act in the US, but there may be a temptation to use some trade restrictive measures to address the situation, but we should really be cautioning against such moves. And of course, I think Japan, since it has been, as Nakatomi-san said, a long and strong supporter of the multilateral trading system, it should stick to this support and principle, and let's say our position supportive of free and open trade. Now, having said that, there are recent issues which have come up in different contexts, and particularly due to the pandemic and then to the geopolitical situation and the war in Ukraine, that are not, of course, addressed directly by trade policy per se, but the measures taken in the context of those issues and crises, let's say, are certainly very relevant for trade policy as well. And that, again, some conflicts, trade-offs, even policy mistakes can be made when viewed from a trade policy standpoint. And number one is national security and supply chain resilience. It's understandable and it is certainly necessary to address the difficulties that have been occurring in global supply chains and also the resilience of those supply chains that have actually become very global. But on the other hand, those measures taken in the context of national security and supply chain resilience may have undue trade restrictive effects. And so what I pick up in Japan is that there has been new legislation, rather comprehensive. The one maybe overarching one is the Economic Security Promotion Act, which appears to give substantial discretion to the government to, let's say, intervene in the trade of certain goods and services, and that the extent or the effect of the legislation on let's say, the degree of liberalization of Japanese trade in goods and services cannot be assessed very easily because of this discretion, and that we will need to probably watch this over time to see how the particular measures are implemented. But at least it has some let's say issues which may be qualified as a trade-off between national security and economic efficiency, and therefore I write here need to see how new legislation is implemented. And having said that, of course, in the context of the formulation of this policy, the Japanese government has made clear that basically the measures taken to be WTO compliant, and that unnecessary limitations to trade will not be introduced. But I mean, that's a very general proclamation. Now, the second issue I would say is really the climate transition, and included more broadly in the issue of sustainability or the SDGs. And Japan being one of the many countries that have declared or committed to net zero emissions by 2050, we will have to question how this is going to happen, or how we can make it happen through a credible transition pathway. And therefore, certain measures which are, again, quite necessary and also legitimate to contain energy price hikes in the immediate term could work against some of the, let's say, measures to enable or achieve the net zero commitment by way of an overall reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, and therefore that may put the net zero commitment at risk. Now, of course, I will receive immediate counter arguments from the ministries involved that even taking into account the likely effects of those near-term measures, the Japanese government is strongly committed to the 2050 net zero target. But again, here we will have to monitor progress towards that goal, and this certainly will have implications for trade policy as well. And then Nakatomi-san referred to this green transformation policy or GX policy, which for which again a comprehensive policy document was issued recently. And I tried to read through all this, but again, looking at each of those measures is not really possible at this point in time to assess what effect those measures will have, or what implications those measures will have on trade per se. And therefore, we should make sure as those policy measures are implemented, again, make sure that they're not discriminatory or protectionist. But then what would come immediately into our mind is the US Inflation Reduction Act and the EU CBAM, and therefore this will not be something unique to Japan. It will be certainly something that will have to be discussed. Well, I would say G20, but maybe even beyond G20, in again making sure that globally we somehow enable or achieve the targets that we have set for ourselves under the Paris Agreement and the subsequent COP meetings. Now, there is a coalition of trade ministers on climate, which again is something very new, if I understand correctly. And this was only last month that this came into existence, and now there are many commitments or let's say prioritizations made in this document. And there is one particular paragraph that I would like to focus on, which is to identify trade-related strategies supportive of the most vulnerable developing and least developed countries. And because, of course, if we talk about climate, we simply cannot leave any country behind. And the issue of the developing and least developed countries will come to the forefront, because those are the countries also suffering the most from climate change as of today. Now, going on to emergency measures, structural policy measures, and trade. So COVID-related measures should be certainly evaluated, and of course, to the extent possible, those will need to be removed or gradually repealed. But on the other hand, of course, we will have to evaluate what effects as a whole those measures had on the economy and therefore on trade as well. And I'm afraid that there has been an issue of moral hazard in various sectors, or the particularly for the small and medium-sized enterprises, and those will have to be first, of course, assessed and then addressed. This again will have trade policy implications, of course, and well, on the whole, of course, this again is not something unique to Japan, but we also know that countries took different measures, or at least placed their importance on different policy levers in dealing with the pandemic, and so it will certainly be useful if countries compared experiences and perhaps made their own assessments of what those measures, what effects those measures had on trade. And I'm of course thinking of vaccines and drugs, but not just that, of course. Now, labor market reform and human capital development. For Japan, this has always been an issue that immigration policy has been restrictive, and that has certainly its benefits for the domestic population, of course, but with a declining population and a labor shortage, very low unemployment rate despite a relatively low growth economy. The treatment of foreign workers, particularly the skilled workers, would need to be reconsidered rather urgently, actually. And there was a news article last Friday, I think, of a further relaxation of visa requirements for skilled foreign workers. But let's say this will be one agenda item on the government's priority list. And this is, of course, having in mind or keeping in mind the movement of natural persons mode under the GATS. Now, just one last word, and I'm sorry, I may be already a bit over time. It's a fact that Japan relies heavily on global supply chains and free and open trade, on energy sources, on natural resources, and therefore it is in Japan's interest, and it is in also the interests of Japan's trading partners that it takes an active role in WTO reform and negotiations, and demonstrate stronger leadership. And so, of course, this is my hope, because I'm now a private sector citizen, that the government will certainly take further steps to really be very vocal in the WTO arena. And on transparency, actually, I'm currently working on the issue of transparency in the form of corporate disclosure requirements on sustainability at the IFRS Foundation, which houses the International Sustainability Standards Board. But anyway, Japan is an active participant in this work. Transparency hopefully will improve globally through enhanced corporate disclosure under such initiatives. But at the WTO, I think, of course, this is also an important agenda item. So thank you so much. I hope this was of some use to your discussion, but really it has been a privilege to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Kono-san. It is our privilege to have you here and listening to you. I mean, your point on the structural policy is very interesting. I'll come back to that later and relate to what Nakatomi-san and Simon has just said. We don't have much time. I think about 30 minutes less. I immediately open a floor for question and answers. So, Kono-san, could you exit the share screen so we can come to the come to the question and answers. I understand that Alejandro has 3 small questions. When he says small questions, it's small question with big significance behind. So, Alex, floor is yours. Please go ahead.
Oh, thank you, Lou, and thank you to Simon, Nakatomi-san, and Kono-san for such great presentations. First, my first point is, many of you will recall the Quad in the United States, EU, Japan, and Canada, a core group of the WTO, and before that, the GATT. anything that was to be done in the multilateral trading system require a consensus of these four. Now, towards the turn of the century, the Quad ceased to exist, if you will. It never had any formal existence. And Canada and Japan were replaced, so to speak, by Brazil, India, and China. That now became the core group along with the United States and the EU. This is a reflection of the growth of Brazil, India, and China, but also it's the fact that because the importance of agriculture and fisheries negotiation in the case of Japan, I think, led to a certain paralysis of Japan's leadership and the pursuit of a very ambitious trade liberalization agenda, because Japan knew that if any ambitious results were to be achieved, then they would have to pay a high price in terms of agriculture support, and the same on fisheries. Something similar happened with Canada, but we'll leave that for another occasion. Will this change? Because I've heard, particularly Kono-san speaking of Japan's leadership and WTO reform. So, will Japan's now become more aggressive? Is it still politically a very sensitive issue, agriculture, as it was 20 years ago, and thus to maintain let's say a balanced agenda and to have credibility? I'm just wondering whether the agriculture lobby and the fishery lobby will always exercise a drag in terms of Japan's positioning, or has that changed? My second point is just to highlight the leadership that Japan exercised on the CPTPP once the United States left that grouping, which was a very positive thing, I believe. And I'm just wondering what is, or what should be, Japan's position towards accession of 5 new economies, China, Chinese Taipei, South Korea, among others. And my last question, what exactly is the free and open Indo-Pacific that Nakatomi-san mentioned in his presentation? Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Those are really small questions to answer. I will give floor maybe in the reversed order to the 3 speakers. Maybe first Kono-san, to be followed by Nakatomi-san, and then Simon. Kono-san, please. Yeah, any question you want to answer. Yeah.
Thank you, but I'm not close enough to the inner circles of government to really answer those questions, which are quite relevant ones. But what I can perhaps sense is that there has been a certain rethink of Japanese policy in the areas that you mentioned, agriculture, fishery, etc. And of course, people may remember that when the first TPP draft was being negotiated, there was a lot of what's the word, resistance from those sectors. But then over time, actually, the government did come to support certain reforms in those sectors, and that I think we should realize, I mean, this is not really trying to read the minds of the government officials in charge, but in a way, for a country like Japan, which has really now seen its agricultural and fishery industries shrink, and also have seen that actually in terms of volume, not that great, but some exports of Japanese agricultural products actually been welcomed in many parts of the world. This probably has, in a way, stimulated somewhat a move towards not exactly aggressive, but more positive export promotion policy by the agriculture ministry. So, I mean, I don't think I can answer the question fully, but what I see is some change and positive movement. And in terms of initiatives, yes, the free and open Indo-Pacific is something that the government has been pursuing. And actually, I listened to Prime Minister Kishida and Foreign Minister Hayashi speak at a conference yesterday, and they were referring to this. I think this is something that Japan really wants to pursue and promote. Thank you.
That's good. Thanks a lot. Nakatomi-san, maybe 3 minutes and to be followed by Sam.
Okay, so I'll try to be short. Let me see about IPEF. Yeah, the idea was, I think, expressed by President Biden in May 2022, and actually the negotiation was kicked off in September 2022, and now US, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Korea, India, Fiji, ASEAN 7 countries are involved in the initiative. And the first meeting was held in Australia in December, and the second meeting was held in India in February. Well, that's still, I think, being discussed, and we don't know the exact shape. Well, and the areas for discussion is first, of course, trade, but that's not, I think, NAMA negotiation type of thing. And so it's clean energy, clean economy, supply chain has many elements, and fair economy. These are the areas for discussion. They are, I think, discussing these 4 things, but still it's too early to tell how, I think, the framework will be crafted. That's what I can say regarding IPEF. On agriculture, yeah, the question was raised by Ru-san and Hara-san. Well, that's not necessarily an easy question, but there have been, I can say, 3 changes. First, I think we've had the FTA lessons. That's different from the pre-FTA situation. That's the first thing I can say. And second, Japan has been active in fishery subsidy negotiation. That's another lesson. And number 3, as Kono-san explained, the export promotion is put emphasis by Agriculture Ministry. These, I think, are different from the past period. And definitely, I think Japan and Japanese agriculture, I think people need to be seriously engaged in talks in WTO. That's what I can say at this moment. And regarding G7 summit, yes, Japan needs to, I think, have a positive role. And let me see. I can, but from my I think as a point of view, I can explain a bit about the G7 summit. The key days are first, I think, summit in May 19-21 in Hiroshima, and trade ministers meeting will be held April the 4th. And my guess is that I think there are 5 or 6 items I think of importance. First, I think they will, I think, put the emphasis, Japan will put the emphasis on promoting free and open trade and investment while safeguarding economic security. But this issue is something we discussed today. And WTO reform and pathway to MC13. Yeah, but that means I think, well, Japan wants to have deliverables by MC13. But I don't know the details at this moment. I think government people have in mind regarding WTO reform. And the third issue may be establishing a level playing field that relates to, I think, economic security issue, I guess, and ensuring supply chain resilience, as I explained. And finally, of course, I think Japan will put emphasis on trade and development, strengthening engagement with the global south. These are the possible topics for discussion, but there's no formal discussion among the G7 members up until now. But that's just my guess. These are the things I think I can answer at this moment. But I may touch upon other issues if there are any other issues I think raised by the participants today. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Nakatomi-san. Those information on G7 is very important. Simon, do you want to say a few words, please? You need to unmute yourself, please. Yeah.
Actually, Lou, I don't. I'd rather hear from 2 or 3 more people from the audience to see what questions they have. Thanks.
Okay, thanks a lot. Who else have questions? Anyone? John, I see you. No, okay. We have about 10 minutes. I think I have 2 questions on my side. First one, probably I give floor to Simon to answer first, because in your presentations and also that of Nakatomi and Kono-san, is that Japan does have a need for structural reform internally on macroeconomic development, labor market, and highly protected markets like agriculture, measures on TBT and SBS, touching both ag and non-ag, so on and so forth. But these also need to be, how to say, relate to multilateral front. I mean, many things we're talking about here, including transparency that Kono-san has touched upon, is also are also being discussed within the WTO on the WTO reform or others like national security through different formats. So what I meant to ask is simply, how do we expect Japan, Simon, as you see always as keen observer, what kind of reforms do we need from Japan, and how do we need that kind of reform which would be helpful for the WTO world? I mean, putting all these things together. Simon, please. Yeah.
Thanks, Lou. I think drawing from what we know about the macroeconomic performance of Japan since the crash of 1989, when Japan has taken steps to tighten up lending through the banking system and to ensure that firms that need to die do die, or the firms that need to shrink do shrink, then they have seen improvements in productivity and alike. And I think you asked what's the multilateral dimension to this. It is, again, in the area of subsidies. Japan extensively props up industries through the banking system. That banking system is not transparent. And maybe if there was a lot more transparency as to who is receiving aid and questions were asked about which firms are being bailed out, then firms could not count on the government bailing them out in the future, and they might take steps to raise productivity, improve their products, and develop more. And the firms that cannot should contract and release resources for the firms that can. And the decade after the Great Crash in Japan showed that when Japanese banks just bailed out and rolled over loans to inefficient firms, those firms just sucked in resources which were not available for dynamic firms. And so you could think of a process of transparency and subsidies and opening up in this respect as a way of supporting microeconomic reform and productivity improvement in Japan. And this could be an interesting test case, but it's one which would involve some degree of pain, but Japan has been through that before, and now is the time to go through that again.
Thank you, Simon. That's excellent. The second question, probably more to Nakatomi-san and Kono-san, is like Alex did, that is a small one. But this is a question on which probably Japan is of particular significance. I mean, it's about the geopolitical landscape that we're in now, both within WTO and beyond. If we look at Japan in this whole wave of geopolitical situation, is that, of course, it's about US and China, to simplify it. But Japan, on one hand, is very, as Alex said, is very kind of active on IPEF, participating, leading on G7, and also leading on CPTPP after US quit. On the other hand, Japan is also part of the RCEP, which China and Japan are all in, so they are connected, and they have also China, Korea, and Japan free trade, trilateral free trade negotiation going on. So Japan is actually economically close to both, and Japan is also geographically in the center of this geopolitical situation. So my question is simply that how does Japanese government or Japanese society community experts look at this issue, and what do you think, a kind of balance or more towards the other side or whatever? It's more than trade, but I think it would be good to have a straightforward answer on that. So maybe Nakatomi-san first, and then Kono-san. Yeah, please.
Yeah.
Nakatomi-san. Yeah.
Yeah. Let me see. I'd like to touch upon, I think, Lu-san's question. Yeah. Well, as I explained, I think Japanese value chain, I think, covers, I think, the globe. Yeah. And we need to connect with the US. We need to connect with the China and ASEAN and other countries as well. And I think we need to have an active role in creating, I think, the regime for the future. I think, for improving our transparency, yeah, I think, creating ideas, and I think, and in pursuing dialogues with all the members, as the WTO at the core, yeah. Well, that's consistent, yeah. And FTAs, I think, to some extent, I think, the tool to alleviate our burden and to deepen, I think, our dialogues with other countries, as I explained. And our investment goal is now, I think, if FDI outside is not, sorry, our investment into Japan. Sorry, our FDI into Japan goal is now 80 trillion yen. That can be achieved only through dialogues with foreign entities and foreign companies. Business knows that. A business has already invested 200 trillion yen outside. And to keep that and to get profits from their investment, they need to have a good dialogue with other countries. And we need to have a good, I think, system and regulations everywhere. Linking, I think, Japanese economy with the world is, I think, essential for us to survive. And so, transparency and dialogues are key for us. And that may be, I think, expressed in the expression, I think, reinforcing a global value chain. Yeah, that's the first point. About Simon's, I think, position. Well, I may touch upon further if I have time, but I really didn't have time to, I think, analyze your paper because I'm a newcomer, and And I very much would like to, I think, to look at your paper in detail. And well, Japan has, I think, domestic measures based on various policy purposes, but we don't know how, I think, these measures are looked at by other countries. And we need to have a dialogue for better understanding of the system. And by doing that, I think we can change our system as well. So transparency, notification, these are very important. That's our belief. And the Japanese government position, I don't know exactly, but I think I believe they have, I think, similar position. But in FTAs, we've had good dialogues. Outside, I think that should be the same. Yeah, that's what I wanted to tell. And about, I think, subsidies, general, I think, position of Japanese government is we need to be consistent with WTO agreements. Yes, but about specific subsidies, I don't know the position. But to understand, I think Simon's, I think, analysis better, we need to know what actually, I think, your trade alert is referring to. And then we may have a clue to have a better understanding of the analysis and to have a better solution. That's what I can say at this moment. Thank you.
Yeah, that's very important, Nakatomi-san, especially about that dialogue. I think I concur with you that that's best need to be in a WTO multilateral dialogue with all the sides. I think it would be important. Kono-san, do you have anything to add, please?
I have to mention that I'm not sure I agree with Simon's point about subsidies or de facto subsidies through the banking system is the issue as of today. I would rather think, and when I mentioned moral hazard, I meant that the issue now is really that the ultra low or negative interest rates environment and combined with cash handouts, actually quite generous ones to particularly smaller enterprises have possibly created some moral hazard issues which people increasingly are concerned about. The issues of loans from particularly the public sector banks and financial institutions was something that mattered in the past, but as of today, I'm not sure whether I agree that is a major issue for the WTO context in particular. But anyway, on the main point, actually, I'm a little concerned that recently in the political circles, there is a heightened sense of the need to strengthen defense capacity and also to, in a way, review the whole national security policy of the country, and steps have already been taken. And this is, of course, very much due to the rising geopolitical tensions, well, of course, Japan is a neighbor to Russia, but we have North Korean missiles flying over us very frequently these days, and we have Chinese ships and Korean ships, all, of course, circling the country, which has really heightened the sensitivities and sometimes even the passion of parliamentarians, which could result in some restrictive positions of the Diet towards free and open trade. I mean, I hope, and I hope this doesn't happen, or I at least as of today, I'm not talking about a real and immediate concern, but at the same time, there is a possibility that public opinion will be drawn into that kind of mode, which can be a risk to Japan's traditional and strong support for free and open trade. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think trade, instead of being undermined by this highly geopolitical situation, instead it should be an instrument to contribute to the resolution of such a geopolitical tensions here. So I think we're coming end to our closure of our session here. To due respect to all the three speakers, I just want to give maybe 1 minute to each of you, starting from Simon, to see whether you have any concluding remarks you want to make or you want to comment on others' presentations. Simon, please. Thank you.
Thanks, Lou. I do think this discussion today has been very interesting, and I think it highlights the challenge we face in these sessions between discussing what Japanese commercial policy has actually been versus the sort of broader themes of the day. And I think one of the things we'll have to think about is, are we focusing on preparing for the TPP and TPRs, or is this a broader discussion about where Japan's trade policy is going given the current geopolitical trends? Of course, there are links between the two, but I wonder if we're being as faithful to the TPR supportive deliberation as we could be. That's all. Thanks.
Yeah, my straightforward answer to that is simply that I think, of course, we're trying to support the traditional TPR, but we shouldn't go beyond that. I think there are many bigger things behind that we need to discuss for sure in the future TPR initiative. Nakatomi-san, you please also 1 minute.
Today we could have a very interesting and good discussion. Well, I think that the background for Japanese measures in the past 2 to 3 years, I think basically based on the three things as I explained. And that was a difficult time for Japan, and perhaps I think that was a difficult time for other countries as well. And we very much would like to, engage with, other countries to come up with a good solution for everybody. And as a WTO as the basis for our system. But we need to understand each other first, and we need to work together. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. That's very important for us to work together. Kono-san, please, your concluding remark. Yeah. Thank you.
First, this has really been quite a good learning opportunity for me, and also really a privilege to be able to express my opinion in this distinguished panel. And of course, I thank my fellow panelists for really giving a lot of comprehensive detail and information on not just Japan, but the global trade arena. I believe in the WTO system, and I consider myself as a free trader. I did participate not just in the GATS agreement negotiations, but also on bilateral and plurilateral negotiations in the past, including TPP. And well, the environment is not really an easy one. It may be even becoming even more difficult to forge a global and comprehensive agreement. But at least what we should make sure is that we don't backtrack on what we have achieved, or at least what we've been trying to preserve over time, because this has actually benefited the world a lot. I mean, I really want to find more economic analysis, sound, of course, economic analysis based on evidence that the global system has benefited countries and actually enabled an immense rise in living standards across so many countries. And so let's say, I hope this group will have a strong influence. Actually, for Japan, this is a golden opportunity because the G7 presidency, because of the various meetings taking place, and we really should benefit from that opportunity. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Kono-san. We as a group are trying to do our humble work in helping the system and then WTO work. Of course, I mean, beyond WTO, that as you said, G7, Japan, and trade issues there. If there's anything we can be of use, I think we will welcome any kind of a signal from Japanese community on that. So with that, I want to, on behalf of myself, but also on Clem, who has been putting a lot of efforts in preparing this, in thanking all the three panelists and also the participants, and also the small questions by Handel and others. So thanks a lot, and we look forward to engaging you next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.